throughout, feel free to interrupt me at any point. Okay, well, let's jump right in then. So the motivation of this study is that police in the United States engage in a variety of enforcement activities that culminate in the making of over 10 million arrests in the average year. The severity of these arrests range from serious, violent, and property arrests to things like discretionary arrests for low-level offenses like loitering. Every type of enforcement activity has the potential for some social cost, either a direct impact on the arrested individual or some effect on neighborhood residents. And so these social costs have to be weighed against the potential crime-reducing benefits of enforcement activity. So an important policy issue is understanding, well, what are the crime-reducing benefits, or what are the crime impacts of these various dimensions of enforcement? So there is a large literature in criminology and other areas of crime research showing that police employment reduces crime. So these studies show, using a variety of methods, that when you compare quasi-experimentally departments that increase their police force size to similar departments that don't increase their police force size, you see a reduction in crime. So we have fairly robust evidence that, at least at the margin, at current levels of employment, the hiring of an additional officer would reduce crime significantly. Now, that being said, there is much less known about the impact on crime of these various dimensions of enforcement holding fixed levels of police employment. And so that's going to be the focus of our paper today. And what I'll say also is that, given that we've had this growing public scrutiny of the police and calls for reforms to the police in light of the last decade of high-profile deaths at the hands of police, an important policy question is asking whether there are any of these dimensions of enforcement that could be scaled back without sacrificing public safety. So a particular component of policing that's received a lot of attention lately is the heavy reliance on sanctions for low-level offenses as part of this larger broken windows philosophy of policing. So broken windows comprises many different beliefs and strategies related to policing, but one important component of it is this belief that heightened enforcement against low-level offending can be an effective strategy to reduce crime. So the proponents for broken windows policing argue that this strategy has been critical to the crime decline in the last 30 years. So the United States has experienced this historic decline in crime from 1990 to the present. And criminologists, other crime researchers, and many police officers believe that broken windows policing has played a role in contributing at least to some part of this crime decline. As a corollary to this argument, these proponents also have this concern that pullbacks to enforcement that have occurred recently have also contributed to crime increases. So this is what's called depolicing. Other people have called it the Ferguson Effect. So this has been particularly relevant in the last decade of this heightened scrutiny of deaths at the hands of police, where what you see is simultaneously an increase in social unrest and often increases in crime, and at the same time, a reduction in police enforcement. And these proponents of broken windows policing argue that some of that increase in crime could be due to the decline in enforcement. So on the other side of this argument, the opponents of the heightened enforcement of low-level offending argue that there are large human and economic costs of low-level sanctions, and also that these high levels of enforcement for low-level offenses disproportionately impact minority and low-income communities. So recently there's been a growing number of studies looking at this question. To cite a few here, so Steve Mello, who is a frequent co-author of mine, he has a study looking at the impact of traffic tickets on people's economic outcomes. And so what he finds is that when people get a speeding ticket for even a small fine, that can have significant deleterious impacts on people's financial health, especially low-income individuals. Another study is by Baker, Hicks, and De La Campa, studying New York City's stop and frisk strategy. And what they find is that when a precinct has institutes an increase in stop and frisk activity, they find significant reductions in test scores for Black and Hispanic children living in that neighborhood. Okay, so again, to recap what I said before, there are social costs to these types of enforcement strategies. And so we want to know, well, can we motivate these by some crime reduction benefit? So the research question we're going to be asking in this study is, do reductions in arrests increase crime? And what we're interested in is looking at a decrease in arrest activity, holding fixed police employment, holding fixed police presence within a city, and also holding fixed other dimensions of police enforcement. And I'll give a little more detail about what other dimensions I'm thinking of later. So the main empirical challenge we're going to be facing is that changes in arrests are obviously non-random, and they often reflect or coincide with changes in crime. So there are a bunch of different stories you can think of here. So the most obvious one is that, well, you're arresting people if they're committing offenses, typically. So if you see an increase in crime, that's mechanically going to tend to increase arrests. Arrest activity can also be endogenous to the criminal environment. So when you see increases in crime, the police department might say, let's change our strategy, let's increase our arrest activity to help reduce crime. This is certainly the case globally and historically. So the broken windows philosophy was developed in the 80s at a time when crime was historically high in the United States. And you can also imagine there are cases where arrests and crimes are kind of jointly confounded by some third factor. So again, going back to these cases of high-profile deaths by police, you see this case where the criminal environment is changing broadly. We see increases in crime, we see reductions in arrests, and it's not really obvious how do you say how much of that crime increase was due to the change in arrest activity. Okay, so overall, this is a fairly difficult empirical question to address, this causal question. So what we're going to be doing in this study is exploiting a natural experiment that causes police to change their enforcement activity. And we're going to argue that there's also not going to be any change in social unrest or civilian trust. And what these events are going to be are police line of duty deaths. So these are instances where officers are killed in their line of work. So what we're going to find is that in the 1 to 2 months after an officer is killed in the line of duty, that officer's department has a 5 to 10% decrease in the number of arrests that they make. So as you might expect, officer deaths are acutely salient to the officer's peers. This is a traumatic event for officers. We're going to argue that this 5 to 10% decrease in arrests is likely due to a behavioral response on the part of officers due to increased fear. But on the other hand, these officer deaths are far less salient to the community than they are to the officers. And what I'll also show you is that in comparison to high-profile deaths at the hands of police, these events are far less salient to the community as well. Therefore, we're going to argue that any change in crime following an officer death will be attributable to the decline in arrests rather than any kind of other change in the environment. And so to give you a preview of findings here, despite the significant reduction in arrests, we don't observe any increase in crime. So our estimates are going to be able to rule out increases in index crimes of more than 3.4%. So going back here to this 5 to 10% reduction in arrests, If you go to the literature on police employment and you had said, well, let's suppose we had a 5 to 10% reduction in police employment, what would we expect to happen to crime? The estimates in that literature would say you're going to get a bigger increase in crime than 3.4%. So basically, what we can say here is that we can rule out elasticities of crime with respect to arrests that are the elasticities you find in the crime to employment literature. We're also going to look at heterogeneity across departments in the magnitude of this decline and the duration of decline. And what we're going to find is that departments with larger or longer arrest declines also do not have crime increases. So we don't find any evidence of like a threshold decline or a threshold duration beyond which you actually start to see crime increases. Okay, so those are the main findings that we're going to have in this study. Let me pause for a second and see if anybody has any questions at this point. If not, okay, great. So let me tell you where we see ourselves being situated in the literature here. So, like I said, there's a big literature looking into the impacts of broken windows policing. A lot of this literature is focused on New York City. And what some of these studies do is they say, well, let's look at observational variation over time in arrest activity in various neighborhoods and see how does that relate to crime rates. And so some of these studies say, well, you see that when there's an increase in misdemeanor arrests, there's a concurrent decrease in crime. There's also some critical appraisals of these studies saying, well, this observational variation could be confounded by other factors here. One thing is that these arrest declines typically come with some lag after the crime increases. And so what you might be picking up is the mean reversion of crime back to its historic averages when you see these arrest increases. And what we also see are some studies looking at these big policing interventions in specific neighborhoods. So like hotspots, policing interventions where you see an increase in police presence, increase in enforcement, and variety of other types of enforcement. And those studies often find crime decreases. But because you're looking at this kind of bundled intervention, it can be hard to say what part of that intervention is actually causing the crime decline. So our contribution to this literature we think of as being, we're going to be exploiting credible variation in arrests. So we think we have better variation in arrests, but we also have variation in arrests holding fixed all these other dimensions. And we're also going to be using a nationwide sample. So our estimates are going to be representative for a nationwide sample of police departments. There's this literature in police scandals and public scrutiny, which find broadly that when you have some kind of police scandal, for many of these studies, it's a death at the hands of police. You find both a reduction in police activity, so police pull back their enforcement. You also see an increase in crime in a lot of these settings. And our contribution to this literature is that we are interested in asking whether these pullbacks in enforcement can increase crime, but we're going to be doing it in a setting where the criminal environment is plausibly not affected by social unrest. There are a lot of studies that look at changes in police institutions where those changes lead to reductions in arrest. So one particularly prominent study here is by Alex Moss, looking at when there are union contract negotiations, and when unions lose their negotiations, the police reduce their enforcement activity by a lot, and you see these crime increases. These studies typically find a lot of different types of enforcement changing when you see these changes in police institutions. And so our contribution here is that we're going to be able to, again, isolate changes in arrest activity separate from other features of the setting. And finally, I would argue that we make what we think of as a pretty compelling data contribution to this literature. So first, we're collating a bunch of publicly available data at the monthly level on crimes, arrests, traffic stops, and traffic fatalities across these various police agencies. But what we're also doing is we've collected a bunch, we've hand collected a bunch of micro data on 911 calls to the police for over 70 cities. So this is data that's maintained at the agency level. So we went and made these public records requests for these micro data. And what this means is we're going to be able to examine the impact of arrest declines on a wide variety of crime types. It's also going to allow us to rule out some alternative hypotheses for what we see in the data, and I'll be more specific about that going forward. Okay, so to give you an outline of the talk, I'll give you some background on these deaths at the hands of police or deaths of police officers. Talk about the data empirical strategy. I'll then go through our main results, and then at the end, I will talk about this Dallas, Texas case study where we have one death of one line of duty death of a police officer, where we have very rich micro data, so we can not only corroborate these national findings, we can also rule out some alternative hypotheses with some of this rich data. Okay, so officer deaths are acutely salient to police officers. There are about 60 felonious officer deaths per year, nearly all from gunshot wounds. And these events are highly salient for police officers. So this is part of the police culture to kind of commemorate these officer deaths. Officers kind of know, and as part of their training and as part of police culture, that there are these risks to their job. So these are very salient events for officers. There has been some sociological research showing that officers view their work in life or death terms. And there's a lot of commemoration around these deaths. So when an officer dies in the line of duty, there's a formal police funeral with dress uniforms and 21 gun salutes, yearly ceremonies and fundraisers and physical memorials, wrist bracelets and tattoos and so on. So Sierra Arevalo, who's a sociologist at UT Austin, has done a lot of research on kind of the police culture around these line of duty deaths. And if any of you have watched The Wire, they also kind of have these scenes where an officer dies in the line of duty, and they have all these commemorations around it. So an important question here is, how are police going to respond to these officer deaths? And it's not obvious ex ante what you would expect. So on the one hand, you might imagine that there'd be an increase in enforcement or use of force because of kind of retaliation against this incident, or just the heightened fear might lead to an increase in enforcement. There have been a few studies that have found this. So this study by Holtz, Ba, and Rivera, looking at data in Chicago, find that when a police officer is assaulted, that officer's peer group increases their use of force in the months after. This study by Legewi, which I believe is in NYPD, also finds a similar effect, an increase in enforcement after these officer incidents. On the other hand, you might expect that there's a decrease in enforcement and interactions because officers are now afraid of the risks in their line of duty. And so maybe you want to just pull back in your interactions because every interaction could be one that leads to some life or death situation. And so there's a study by Carly Wills Sloan that I believe is looking at police departments in Indiana that finds basically this, that when an officer is assaulted, other officers in the department reduce their enforcement activity. And as I said, this is what we're going to find in our paper as well, using this nationwide sample, that when you have a line of duty death of an officer, that officer's peers reduce their enforcement activity. Okay, so this is evidence that this is very salient for the police officers, but these line of duty deaths are far less salient in the community. Now, so I see a question here by Salem for how long. So do you mean how long is the enforcement reduction going to be?
Yes, so is it like just a short-term reaction, or is it something that you see over weeks or months after that?
Yeah, okay, great. So I'm going to show you that. Like, you can think of it as like kind of a first stage in our study. Nationally, it's going to be 1 to 2 months of reduction in arrests. In Dallas, where we have really good data and we can measure it very precisely, it's a 9-week reduction in arrests.
Okay, thank you.
We do have some heterogeneity across departments in the kind of the duration of arrest activity. Okay, thanks. So these line of duty deaths are far less salient in the community. By the way, I can see the comments, like they kind of drop down here. If I miss your question and like I didn't answer, you can also just interrupt me, and it's possible I just missed your question. Okay, so what we see here is this is Google search data on search activity after either a civilian is killed by the police or an officer is killed in the line of duty. So this left panel here is showing Google searches for civilians killed by police. We use a variety of different search terms here that are related to that, like police killing, death by police. What we've done here is, so Google search trends data is kind of funny. You don't get the total count volume. What you get is basically you can search something and it'll say like, well, this is the date at which there were the most searches. We're going to normalize that to 1. And then everything else is like a fraction of that. So what we've done is we've normalized our searches to search terms that are related to myocardial infarction, so heart attacks. We played around with a bunch of different kind of norms or like benchmarks of search terms. The results are all basically the same, but we wanted some search term that's not seasonal and is not so extreme of a search term that our search term that we care about like doesn't even show up in the figure. So this is normed by these other search terms, and what you find is that in the weeks after a death by a police officer, you see the significant increase in searches related to police killings. In contrast, when you look at officer deaths, same benchmark here, but now we're looking at search terms officer death or officer killed. You see an increase in searches, but the increase is much smaller and is much less sustained. So after 2 weeks, the search intensity has basically gone back down to 0. Sorry, let me clarify here. Actually, we're not searching the generic terms. We're actually searching for the names of the individuals where this happened. So we take the name of the individual either from this death by police or the name of the police officer, and we find this spike here. When you do more generic terms, you actually don't really see much of a spike. You still see a little bit of a spike on civilian deaths, but basically nothing for officer deaths. So if anything, this is kind of an upper bound on the salience of these incidences. Okay, so what data we're going to be using here? So we are going to be using as our primary analysis set crime, arrest, and police data from the FBI Uniform Crime Report. So these are data that police departments voluntarily report to the FBI. You're supposed to report monthly data, but a lot of departments only report annually. So we're restricting attention to 2,048 police departments from 2000 to 2018 that are regularly reporting data at a monthly level. And within these data, or among these departments, we have 169 line of duty deaths in 101 departments. So this is definitely a subset of all of the line of duty deaths in this time period. So like I said, there are about 60 in a given year. We have a 20-year period, but we have 169 line of duty deaths. Most of that restriction is coming from the fact that we're restricting attention to these departments that have monthly data. So relative to the departments with no line of duty deaths, in our sample period, the treated departments report on average higher levels of crime, arrests, and officer assaults. And the treated cities are larger and more diverse in populations with higher rates of poverty. Okay, so that's our baseline data. We're going to supplement it with a bunch of other data sets here. So we have traffic fatality records from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So this is every time somebody dies in a traffic accident, we have basically the municipality where it happened and the date it happened. We have 24 departments in our sample with traffic stops data. So this is traffic stops micro data from the Stanford Open Policing Project. We have some fatal use of force data from the FBI supplemental homicide reports and fatal encounters, which is a civilian database. So this is going to be one of our other measures of police enforcement that we're going to look at around these line of duty deaths. And then we have this original data collection that we've done. So the first one is this 911 call data that we have from 72 cities. And we also have highly detailed micro data for Dallas, Texas. So we're going to have 911 calls, crime records, and arrest records down to the individual incident for Dallas, Texas.
So, Felipe, maybe a question.
Yeah.
So, just
Mhm.
to make sure I understand this, so we had over almost a decade about 170 line of duty deaths, right? So
Mhm.
something like 17 to 20 a year. Is that correct reading?
So it's a 19-year period. So
Excuse me,
it's
a 20-year period. So you have like,
we have about 10 we have about 10 incidents a year in our sample.
okay, and how much of the total deaths in the line of duty does this cover? Do you think it's covering most of them, like the vast majority of them, or
So it's about 10 per year, and there are about 10 felonious deaths. Um, sorry, there are about 60 deaths by police in a typical year. And so we think we have about 1/6 of the incidences.
okay?
Um, and basically, all of this is coming from the fact that the outcome data doesn't cover all police departments.
I see. Okay, actually, because I not that I know the literature or the data, but it sounded to me when I saw the number that it's really much lower than I thought that this would be. Another question. So you said from 101 police departments out of more than 2,000. So are you seeing basically repeated deaths in the same departments? That kind of departments are more prone to officers being killed in the line of duty?
Yes, definitely. So bigger departments are more likely to have these line of duty deaths, and they're more likely to have multiple line of duty deaths. So like I think I maybe already showed this. Yeah, so it's 100 departments, 170 line of duty deaths. So a couple of things I'll show you related to that. So the first is that our empirical strategy is going to account for the fact that there are these multiple incidences within a department. We're going to show you heterogeneity across department types. So the arrest declines seem to be bigger in places where these incidents are rarer or less frequent, like smaller departments. Um, and also, given that you have this big difference between the treated and control group, you might be concerned about the empirical strategy using these guys as a control. So the results look similar when you just use treated departments in our empirical strategy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so summary statistics here. I'm showing you basically all of our outcomes separately by the full sample and by treated agencies. Again, the main thing here is just these treated agencies typically are departments with more crime um, and and more arrests. Um, and yeah, that's what I think you should take from this figure here. Okay, so let me describe a little bit these event characteristics. Um, so, like I said, there are 169 officer death events in which 178 officers were killed in our sample, about 10 per year. So, um, if we have more than one officer dying within an incident, we call that kind of one death event. So it's 178 officers, but we have 169 officer death events. Um, the majority of these are gunfire incidences. There's some small number that are vehicular assaults, and 5 are other. We 132 of these are white officers, 24 are black officers, 22 are other, and the majority of these officers are male. The age and experience is pretty much the median age and experience of a police officer. Okay, so the empirical approach we're going to be taking here is a event study design or a difference in differences design here, where YIT is the outcome of we're going to be looking at either arrests or crimes, and the main coefficients of interest are going to be these coefficients on these event time indicators. So D0IT is going to denote it's an indicator for the month that a line of duty death happened. D1IT is the month after. D2 to 11 is the rest of the year after. And D12 plus is everything after that. We're going to be controlling for a set of time varying demographics at the city level. So this is population, age, sex, race composition of the city, median income, and poverty and unemployment for the city. We're also going to have a set of city by calendar month fixed effects. So this is to account for city-specific seasonality. So crime is very seasonal. It's much higher in the summer than it is in the rest of the year. And that kind of seasonality could vary by department. So we have a set of city by calendar month fixed effects. We also have time fixed effects. So this is to account for secular trends over time in crime. And there definitely are secular trends over time in crime in this time period from 2000 to 2018. We also have here a set of city-specific linear time trends. So we're going to allow for each city to have its own unique time trend that we're going to be residualizing. The reason we do this is because, again, there are these big secular changes in crimes and arrests over the course of 2000 to 2018. This is a period of significant reductions in crime, but these reductions were quite heterogeneous across departments. So the places that started with higher baseline levels of crime saw bigger reductions in crime over this time period, as you might expect. So these city-specific linear time trends are meant to account for that. If anybody's interested, I can show you what our results look like without these linear time trends. They look the same, and if anything, a little bit stronger. But just to be conservative, we include this in here because it mutes the results a little bit. Okay, so in line with what Salem asked earlier, so in cities where there are multiple officer line of duty deaths, we're going to sum the indicator variables to maintain one panel per city. Okay, so the results, so basically what we have here is that we're still going to have data at the level of the month by city, but if you're, say, 1 month away from a death that happened, so death happened last month, but then another death happened this month, both of these variables can be turned on at the same time. And they can kind of you can have the value be more than one. So for example, if we had 2 officer line of duty deaths more than a year ago, then this variable here is going to be 2. So we're going to sum up over these. The kind of competing approach you would consider for doing this is having an entire separate panel for each city by line of duty death, so that you're not summing over them, but you basically have the same city showing up in the data more than once. Results are similar doing that approach with these separate panels. And we're also going to show our results graphically with pre-period coefficients included, just so if you have any concerns about pre-period effects or pre-trends, we're going to show you that that's not really an issue here. Okay, so the identification assumptions we have are, first, conditional on controls, the timing of a line of duty officer death within a department is as if random. So this is the typical difference in differences assumption here, which is that you have kind of exogenous timing of these incidences. And we're going to show you with these event studies that there's no pre-period effects. The second assumption here is that these line of duty officer deaths directly shift police behavior, but do not directly impact civilian behavior. You can think of this in the language of like an instrumental variables approach. This is like a instrument exogeneity assumption. This is only affecting one thing. It's affecting officer arrest activity and nothing else. And so if we see changes in anything else, we can ascribe that to the arrest activity. Okay, so let's start. By the way, how am I doing on time? What time are we thinking of ending? Like 3:10, 3:15?
We usually end sometime between the hour and 15 past.
Okay, great. So I'll first start by showing you here that our data lines up really well between the line of duty deaths and the outcome data. So this is showing that when we say that an officer line of duty death happened, the Uniform Crime Reports data actually shows, yes, the number of murder cases does go up. When you do this thing in levels, it goes up exactly by 1. So for those of you who are familiar with the FBI UCR data, they're typically pretty unreliable, or there are fears that it's unreliable. So we think of this as a good sanity check, that the data is cleaned well and linked well, that the treatment data says there was a line of duty death, and the outcome data confirms that there's a line of duty death. Okay. Now, what we see is a sharp decline in police arrest activity. So in the left panel here, I'm showing you quality of life arrests. These are the kind of most low-level and discretionary arrests. When I say discretionary, I mean that these are typically arrests that are initiated by police officers. These are things like arrests for loitering, public drunkenness, and so on. So these arrests decline significantly in the 2 months after an officer death. We see about a 5 to 10% reduction in the 2 months after the officer death for quality of life arrests. Same thing for non-index arrests. So non-index arrests are they're serious crimes, but they're crimes, they're things like fraud, embezzlement, manslaughter, arson. These are sort of miscellaneous arrests that are not the most serious index arrests. Okay, so we see norming this by the average arrest activity in a treated department. We see about a decline of 70 arrests in the first month, 110 arrests in the first 2 months, of which 38 of them are low-level quality of life arrests and 21 are for non-index arrests. And we have over 1,800 traffic stops that are not being performed in the 2 months after. We also observed similar percentage declines in violent arrests and property arrests. These are a little more noisily estimated, but the magnitude in percentage terms is similar. So a 7% reduction in violent and property arrests in the month after this officer death. Now, that being said, while the percentage reductions are the same, the level reduction is much bigger for these low-level offenses. So it's many more low-level offenses that are being foregone relative to no line of duty death. In contrast to this decline in arrest activity, what we find is no resulting increase in crime. So I'm showing you here violent crime and property crime, and it looks fairly smooth around the month of the officer death. You see no increase here in the months after the officer line of duty death, and you don't see any longer term increase for either violent crime or property crime. And what we can rule out is a greater than 3.4% increase in crime in the short term and a greater than 2.9% increase in crime in the long term across both violent and property crime. Okay, so like I said, most of this literature on the impacts of policing on crime are looking at police employment. And these studies will estimate an elasticity of police crime to employment. So I know economists really like elasticities, but they're not as popular in other social science fields. So an elasticity here, is what it's saying is if you increase police employment by 10%, what percentage decline in crime do you get? And the average in this literature finds that you get about a 5% reduction in violent crime and maybe a 5% reduction in violent crime and about a 2.5% reduction in property crime. So we've converted our estimates into elasticities as well. So if you see a reduction in arrests by 10%, how much of a crime increase should you expect? And our estimates for the elasticities can actually rule out the police employment to violent crime elasticity. Okay, so the important thing here is the impact of arrest activity at the margin is qualitatively different from the impact of police employment, which is kind of the main message we're trying to convey here. Okay, so these results are going to be robust to a bunch of different alternative specifications of how you do these regressions. So like I said, you can restrict to treated cities, do a separate panel for each officer line of duty death. You can count the multiple deaths additively. You can also restrict attention to a sample of the data where we have all of the data sets for each city. When you do that, the results look the same. We can drop these city-specific linear time trends, drop city, calendar, month, fixed effects. We can add in state by year fixed effects, which is kind of controlling for state-specific secular time trends. We can control for officer assaults, and we can remove DUI arrests. The results are also the same if you use the raw data rather than a cleaned version of the data we use. It removes outliers. Doing a levels model rather than a log model. I should have mentioned that earlier. All these outcomes we're looking at are the log of the arrest rate and log of the crime rate. That's why I'm saying that we can interpret these as percentage changes. But the results look similar using a levels model, a per capita model where we measure arrests and crimes per 100,000 people, and this other specification here that's meant to be similar to logs. It's inverse hyperbolic sine model. Okay, we can also do these placebo tests where we say, well, let's invent a bunch of fake line of deaths in the data and see what treatment effects we get. And when you create a distribution of those, it's centered around 0, and our real treatment effect is way outside of that distribution. So we're not, that gives you a sense that our standard errors are correct, and we're not kind of picking up something that like an effect that would be there even if you invented these fake events. Okay, and our results are also robust to doing a bunch of different types of difference in specifications. So there's this growing interest in the econometrics literature about how do you do difference in differences studies properly. And there are all these issues that have been highlighted with the typical diff and diff approach. When you do a lot of these alternative specifications in our sample or in our setting, the results look basically the same. Okay. So now let me talk about some alternative hypotheses for what we're observing, and try to argue that these are not what's going on. So one alternative argument would be that the line of duty death is directly reducing crime or victimization. So one story here might be, okay, maybe this is not super salient for the community, but maybe it's salient for like some subset of individuals. Like offenders really know when they're these line of duty deaths, and they're going to pull back their activity. So first, the Google Trends evidence does suggest minimal salience overall. I'll show you in a little bit that we're going to appeal to these 911 call records and traffic fatality data. So the calls are a less filtered measure of criminal activity than crimes, and we're still not going to find an effect there. Traffic fatalities are not subject to any changes in kind of reporting. So we continue to find the same results there. So that's also kind of suggestive of our results. Most importantly for this alternative hypothesis is that we're not going to observe a crime decrease in cities with no arrest response. So I'm going to show you in a second heterogeneity by the magnitude of the decline. And there's a subset of cities where there's no decline in arrests, and you don't see any crime decreases in these cities. So to summarize here, the concern would be, well, these line of duty deaths are directly reducing crime because offenders say, hey, the police are upset, let's kind of pull back our activity. You see that in conjunction with a reduction in enforcement, and so other people increase their offending, and on net you see nothing, but the reality is that enforcement pullbacks do increase crime. So we're arguing here that that's not what's going on, and in cities where there's no arrest response, you don't see a change in crime. Okay, another concern here is that the crime measures that we're using are crime reports made by the police. So for a crime to be said to have happened, it needs to be the case that somebody calls the police and then the police say, yes, a crime did happen, we're writing a report, and that's what's going on in the data. But police might reduce the likelihood of filing crime reports after a line of duty death. So if what happens is that crime is going up, but police now are less likely to write a crime report conditional on an incident happening, that would bias us away from finding crime increases. So what we're going to be using here is our 911 data, which doesn't have this problem that it's filtered by crime reports. And we're not going to see any reduction. We're not going to see any increase in 911 calls. So to highlight it again, these crime reporting effects are a big concern in the criminology literature, this concern that our measures of crime are a function of police reporting behavior. And we think what's cool about our 911 data is that we're uniquely able to address that concern and rule it out as an alternative hypothesis here. Okay, so I've previewed this a lot. So this is what we find here for 911 calls. We similarly find no effect of the officer line of duty death on 911 calls. In the long term, you can rule out, you can rule out here fairly small increases in calls for service in the short term and the long term. And again, these calls for service are for all types of crimes, not just serious violent or property crimes. So we're ruling out crime increases for the whole range of types of offenses. In addition, we can not only say, well, what does this unfiltered measure of crime look like after these line of duty deaths? We can also directly look at the crime reporting rate. So conditional on somebody calling the police, what's the probability the police write a crime report? And we find there's no change here. So we find a very precise null effect here that police don't change their reporting activity after these line of duty deaths. Okay. Final alternative hypothesis here is that other aspects of policing could be changing around these events. So one concern here could be incapacitation or changes in police presence. So first, mechanically, the number of police officers working has gone down because of an officer being killed. But you also could imagine officers taking leave or officers being diverted to investigate the incident, try to find the murderer. We argue that it's unlikely that our effects are due to officer incapacitation. So doing a back of the envelope here for the mean treated department, this arrest decline is equivalent to about 22 officers arrest activity. So 22 officers being incapacitated seems quantitatively too large to be what's going on here. So we don't think this is being driven by incapacitation. And I'll show you that as well for the Dallas data. Okay, so now let me talk about this heterogeneity analysis. So our overall arrest impact is a relatively short-lived 1 to 2 months and a mid-size arrest decline of about 7%. So again, I've argued to you that these are the types of declines that in the employment literature would have suggested, would have led to a crime increase. Those studies are looking at a different time horizon. So police employment is a kind of a permanent change in employment, looking at a long run change in crime, whereas we're looking at these short run changes. So you might be concerned about that as an issue with comparability of these types of studies. That being said, there is also another literature on police presence that finds these rapid impacts. So there's studies that show when you see an increase in the number of police officers patrolling an area, there's a decline in crime that is basically instantaneous and is comparable to the decline in crime you would predict from an employment impact. And so I note this to say our estimates are qualitatively different from these employment and presence impacts, and we don't think it's due just to the time horizon difference. Like even very short time horizons, change in police presence does reduce crime, whereas our estimates here suggest that marginal enforcement does not reduce crime. Now, that being said, we do want to ask, do our null results persist with bigger arrest declines? So what we're going to do here is we're going to say, we're going to try to calculate agency by agency, how much of a change in arrests and how much of a change in crime did we see. So we're going to estimate residuals of the arrests and crime outcomes conditional on the fixed effects of the model, but we're going to exclude those treatment indicators. And then we're going to calculate the difference between these residuals in the month of an officer death versus the residual for the month prior to the officer death for both the crime and arrest outcomes. Since we're kind of stratifying the data by these estimated effects, we're going to use bootstraps. We're going to use a bootstrap approach to get our standard errors. And this is what we find. So these figures are showing, so the left panel here is showing on the x-axis, what was the residual change in arrests for the first month. So here in blue at negative 0.2, this is a department where the number of arrests declined by 20% relative to the month prior to the officer line of duty death. What we find is that across all changes in arrest activity, there's no residual change in crimes. So there's no kind of threshold magnitude beyond which we start seeing these increases in crime. We had originally called these hockey stick figures because that's exactly what we expected. We thought it would be this kind of flat thing, and then at some point there would be an increase, and that's not really what we found. And so this is for the first month crime effect. We don't find anything, but we also don't find anything for the year effect. So zooming in here, the year effect gets a little noisy once we have these. There are fewer people here on the left side, but when you zoom in, you find no crime increases in the year for any kind of residual change in arrests. So let me just say here that this is these are suggestive analyses because what we're doing is stratifying by an outcome. So in contrast to our baseline results, we're not quite as strongly saying, well, there's no crime increase for any decline in arrest activity because the level of arrest decline is potentially endogenous. So you could have maybe differences across departments, and the amount of decline maybe has something to do with how aware the officers are of how important these arrests are for crime. So let me just make that caveat here that we do think of this as a more exploratory analysis relative to everything I've shown you before this. So we are also interested in a similar question, but instead of looking at magnitude of decline, we also are interested in length of decline. So do our results persist with more sustained arrest declines? What we're going to do is estimate these residuals of arrests and crimes conditional on the fixed effects in the model, but exclude these treatment indicators, and we're going to calculate for each city the number of consecutive months after an officer death where the residual is lower than the residual for the month prior to the death. And we're going to relate the average crime effect for cities grouped by duration of decline. Okay. Again, these kind of duration of declines are measured with error. They're an estimated thing, so we're going to be using a bootstrap approach to estimate the standard errors. And here's what we find. So the left panel here, the outcome is again the first month crime effect, and the x-axis here is the number of months of a negative arrest decline. And so the modal department has something like a 1 or 2 month negative arrest effect. And as you'd expect, these guys have no increase in crime. But there are also some departments with 3 or 4 month declines in arrests and some with 5 or more declines in arrests. And even among those departments, you're not seeing an overall increase in crime. And again, you can kind of reject similar levels of crime increases. This right-hand side panel here is showing the year effect. So you might not expect this 5 or more effect to show up in the first month, but you also don't see it show up in the year effect. So again, let me reiterate 2 things. These standard errors are accounting for the noise in kind of designating number of months of negative effects. So we're bootstrapping here. The other thing to say again is that we think of these as suggestive evidence because we don't have an experiment that varies the length of effect. So we're stratifying by the outcome here. Okay, we have additional heterogeneity by kind of subgroup. Yeah, was there a question? Sorry, I thought I heard someone ask. Okay, so we're going to do additional heterogeneity by subgroups. And I'm not going to go into these in the interest of time, but roughly what we find is that basically there are bigger arrest declines in smaller departments and departments with lower crime rates. So again, this is kind of going back to Salem's question at the beginning. We have variation in how kind of surprising these events are. And in places where these events are, you could think of as being more surprising, you have bigger arrest declines. And it's also consistent with our argument that what this is a story about officers being traumatized and it's a fear effect that's driving the arrest declines. Okay, so in the last little bit of time, let me do this final analysis here. So to summarize so far, what we find in our nationwide sample is that in the 2 months after an officer line of duty death, there is a reduction in arrest activity. It's like similar percentage decline for serious and less serious arrests, but in terms of levels, there's a much bigger decline for low-level arrests. Despite that, we don't see an increase in crime, and we can reject fairly small increases in crime. There are two things we kind of there are two concerns with the analysis so far. So the first one is, are other dimensions of enforcement changing? Other than arrest, we want to say this is arrest, but what if there's other things changing, like police presence or use of force? The other concern is the arrest decline a behavioral response, or is it incapacitation? So we are going to be examining a single line of duty death in Dallas, Texas, and we're going to exploit rich data with officer level information to try to ameliorate these concerns and kind of further corroborate our argument about what the mechanism is here. Okay, so this case study is on April 24th, 2018, Officer Rogelio Santander was shot and killed by a shoplifting suspect while working off duty at Home Depot. One second. Okay. Thank you, Zaid. So the officer was working, they were working off duty, but they went to try to kind of apprehend the suspect. They were shot, and other officers came in here to try to address the situation. Like there were other officers nearby. They caught the guy, I think, the next day, but this officer died. This is not quite the same as like a line of duty death because the guy was technically working off duty, but it was still kind of like a police type. It's similar to a line of duty death. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to compare raw data of police and crime activity around the date of this incident. And as a comparison, we're going to be using the previous year around that same date. And so I'll show you event studies so you can see that there's parallel trends between these two dates in 2017 and 2018. Okay, so first thing is that we're going to confirm that the results look very similar to what we found in the national data. So the gray line here is weekly arrests in 2017. And we find that it's smooth around this around April 24th. But in 2018, the year of the officer death, you have similar trends beforehand, though at a lower level. But then you see this big, significant decline for 9 weeks afterwards. This is a 30 to 40% decline in arrests that lasts about 2 months. So it's 9 weeks. And it's a bigger decline than what we found in the national sample. So this is one of the cities where we found actually a significantly bigger decline. Despite that, we don't see any effect on crime. Just like we saw in the national sample, there's no change in crime in the weeks after this line of duty death. So I got a question here in the chat, but I wasn't able to see it. So David asked, cases where there are multiple line of duty deaths in a given episode, have you looked at whether multiple death cases have a stronger impact? No problem. So we did look at this. The results are robust to this. I don't know if so we include those in the sample. And what we're saying is we're looking at the treatment here is an officer death event. So if multiple officers die, we consider that kind of one event. And the analysis is robust to counting that as multiple events. I'm not actually sure if we've stratified by, like, let's just look at those cases where multiple officers died. So I don't actually know if the decline is bigger in those cases. It might be. it's plausible that it is. Yeah, so Salem is saying, here's an example, Dallas, Texas, July 2016. So yeah, this is a very prominent case where 5 officers were killed by a sniper during I think it was a protest. I mean, it wasn't exactly related to the protest. It was a sniper in a building that killed these 5 officers. This is in our national sample. We refrained from looking at it as a case study because that's a case that was so prominent, it was covered nationally, that we were worried that the environment around it was changing as well. So it would be much harder to say, well, the only thing changing is the arrest decline there. But yeah, that's exactly a case where it was multiple officers that died. I don't remember exactly, but I think we did look at that at one point, and we did find that there was a decline. There was a decline around that July 2016 event. I don't remember what the percentage reduction was. Okay. Yes.
Can I maybe ask a question? So
Yeah.
I'm actually happy that David asked this question because I was waiting for you to finish this point so that I ask about that Dallas, Texas shooting in 2016. If you take the shooting that happened at Home Depot, I believe, you said 1 officer was killed. Now, Dallas, Texas is a giant city, giant county. To have an impact, we also have to assume that the public actually knows about 1 police officer killed at a Home Depot, or at least that the public, enough people know about a police officer being killed. I mean, there might be a killing of a police officer 20 minutes from where I am living here, which is Baltimore. I may not hear about it. And so if I don't hear about it and most people don't hear about it, then why should we expect any impact? That's why I think, maybe the 2016 case is a much better case study because it was covered. President Obama was there, President Bush was there. So, it was a really high-profile case.
Yeah, so I think that you are right that when they have these incidences, maybe people don't know about it, even people who live nearby. That is a feature rather than a bug here. So the argument is these cases are salient for the officers, but they're not salient for the individuals. Because what we want to say is, well, what we see is this officer dies. People don't seem to realize that there was an officer death. The police realize it and reduce their arrest activity. And so we're like, okay, great. So they reduce their arrest activity. Does crime respond to that arrest decline? Because of what you just said, any change in crime is likely not going to be due to the actual event itself because people are not super aware of these officer deaths. So I think of that as a feature, not a bug. Yeah,
no,
go
I
ahead.
can see that, but here's the thing. If people don't hear about 1 killing of a police officer, then they may not know that there is a decline in number of arrests. I don't know, for example, if Columbia, where I'm living, or Baltimore City, if they have a decline in police arrests, especially when it comes sometimes with a lag, have to wait for the data to get. So if people don't know if there is a clear decline in the number of arrests, then why should we expect any impact on on crime?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a good point. And that's something people have brought up is like this idea of how salient is the change in arrest. I mean, police enforcement is not exactly always just kind of announced. Like, police hire a new police officer, and that's not announced, and you still see these reductions in crime. I mean, that would be an argument for why you wouldn't expect an impact here, and that is what we find. I don't think of that as like, I mean, I think this maybe is a question of external validity for what if the police department announced, like, to the whole city, hey, we're reducing arrests by 10%, and then what's going to happen to crime? I'm not sure that's exactly like the policy relevant question in the sense that police are not exactly going to be announcing like arrest decline. But
isn't there a couple of instances in New York City where they specifically said that they were going to do that as an intimidation tactic? So I think that does happen, but maybe just rarely, that the police announce like, we're going to pull back and show you how important we are.
Yes. So there have been a couple of cases. We talk about this a little bit in the paper. So there are cases where there are police deaths. There was a police death in New York City in the mid 2010s where the police department said, this is happening because you guys are the mayor is criticizing us, people hate us, and like, you know, we're going to show you how important we are. So they pulled back enforcement. And there are some studies looking at that. There's disagreement in the literature about what effect that had. I think that the conclusion is that that didn't have an effect on crime. So, you know, I think that, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that might be a confirmation here that even if we had these arrest declines with an officer death and they had said, hey, we're traumatized, we're going to reduce enforcement, maybe you're not going to see the crime increase. So yeah, they do announce it sometimes. Some of those, you know, it's not clear how much they actually announce it. Like, it's sort of informal that they do that, but they do announce that they're upset. But anyways, so Salem, what's the question? So it's scaled that back down to stop and frisk. Yeah, there are studies that look at changes in stop and frisk, and those studies don't find any effect of a change in stop and frisk on violent crimes. They do find an effect on misdemeanor crimes, but it's a little bit tricky because the measure of misdemeanor crimes is a function of how much stop and frisk activity there is, like kind of going back to this police reporting issue. But yeah, I know I understand the idea that this arrest decline is not salient. I don't think, or it's not necessarily salient. We don't think of our estimates or the credibility as living or dying on the like presumption that people notice the arrest decline. You know, that's kind of just either that's part of the treatment or it's not. Okay, Kendra has a question here. So have you looked at staffing levels following the shooting? I know you said 22 officer departments, it's not at large. Also, officer burnout over time due to staffing shortages could be compounding. Okay, great question. Let me show you that in the, give me 2 seconds and I'll show you that. Just to confirm here, this is the daily data. Similar thing, you see this decline and then it persists for about 9 weeks. Also, no change in average crime levels. 911 calls also look similar. There's this kind of big decline in 2017. You know, it's one city, so it's hard to know what to make of that. This here is going exactly to this question that was just asked by Kendra. So what we have here is that we can calculate the number of officers that are taking 911 calls around the date of this incident. And so we have the 911 data, and we can calculate, we see which officer took each call, so we can say how many officers are taking calls after this death. And what we find is like there's some perhaps change here. There's not really evidence that like an instantaneous change in police presence. And so we don't think that really there's not evidence here that like a big drop in the number of officers taking calls. Similarly, there's no change in use of force. So we have here all types of officer use of force, and we don't see any change here. So again, other dimensions of enforcement are not changing.
Felipe, I just noticed we're right at time, so let's wrap up, and then those who want to stick around for a little while to chat informally are welcome to. Felipe, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate the talk, and I'm happy to stick around if others want to stick around and chat informally about your work. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you, and thank you for all the comments and feedback. Okay, I can let me see.